Hi, everyone. Welcome to a Defense Priorities live stream. Today's topic will be, does the Middle East still matter? Where we will be discussing the United States' core interests in the Middle East as they exist today and moving forward. Our panelists today will be Mike Domino, Rose Kalanick, and Kelly Greco. So Mike is a public policy manager and fellow at Defense Priorities. He's a former military analyst and counterterrorism officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. At the CIA, he worked on sensitive national security problems spanning from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Most recently, has served as a consultant to the Department of Defense, advising the Joint Chief of Staff and the United States European Command on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Rose Kalanick is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, where her research focuses on international security, energy politics, U.S. grand strategy, and more. Her most recent book, Black Gold and Blackmail, Oil and Great Power Politics, examines why great powers adopt radically different strategies to secure oil access in case of the emergency of war. Rose Kalanick earned her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. Dr. Kelly Greco is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center, where her work focuses on U.S. grand strategy and defense policy, addressing questions about U.S. foreign policy, international security, military force structure, and more. She's also an adjunct associate professor at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University and a non-resident fellow at the Brute Krulak Center for of the Marine Corps University. We will get started with opening remarks from each one of you, and then we will dive into a moderated discussion where we can have some discussion back and forth on what are on the U.S. core interest in the Middle East. The question that we'd like to start off with for opening remarks is, so we know that the U.S. foreign policy has been dominated by the Middle East in the past. Wars and crisis in the greater Middle East has dominated U.S. foreign policy for much of the last 2 decades. Although this has started to change recently, what do you see as core U.S. interests in the region today and over the next 20 years? We're going to go ahead and start with Mike to answer this question.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Sabrina, and thanks, Kelly and Rose, for joining us today. It's great to discuss this topic. I think it's very timely, obviously, with everything that's going on in the region right now. And I think, look, I mean, the core question is, does the Middle East still matter? And to try to keep my opening remarks very succinct, the answer is not really for U.S. interests. And what I would say is that vital or existential U.S. interests in the Middle East are best characterized as minimal to non-existent. And I think if you look at America's experience as the primary security broker in the region for the better part of certainly the last 2 decades, but even going back to really any of the post-World War II order in the region, it has not rendered any lasting political, economic, or security benefits in service of U.S. interests or the American people writ large, I would argue. And I think that if we're standing back and looking at what those core interests might be in the region, there are really 2 that I think come to mind. First would be, access to global markets and natural resources. Free trade and the flow of trade is important for the global economy. It's important for the U.S. economy. And so the United States does have an interest in maintaining a Middle East that can facilitate that is not an issue for the U.S. economy or the economies of our core allies. I'd say, though, that as a net energy exporter and as a country that is on track now, I think to export, crude exports have fallen to just, or imports rather, 1.1 million barrels a month last year. We're on track to be a net energy exporter, and I think that we can really move away from a lot of the previous arguments, I think, underpinning America's economic interests in the region, that they're to do with oil and things like that. the U.S. economy, I think, has shown that it can move on from that. And the second big interest I would identify is preventing credible threats of terrorism against the homeland. And of course, as a former CT practitioner, this is an issue close to my heart. But I would say, if we're being objective about it, look, this is a threat that we can monitor and prevent without, around 40,000 troops permanently stationed in the Middle East. We can use diplomacy. We can leverage our bilateral relationships. We can use over-the-horizon capabilities, as it's called, in the intelligence business, right, to keep a lid on these groups without maintaining the kind of presence that we have in the past. So I'd say, in my answer to that question, those are the two interests, core U.S. interests, that jump out to me. And I think that there are lots of ways to tackle those issues without the kind of force posture that we've had in the region for the better part of 2 decades now.
Mike, thank you so much, Mike. Kelly, would you like to give your opening remarks to the same question?
Sure, great. Well, first of all, thank you to Defense Priorities for hosting today's event and for inviting me to participate at a time when it's more imperative than ever to really rethink U.S. policy in the Middle East. I think the argument I would make is that over the last 30 years, the United States has defined its interests expansively across the world. But nowhere is that truer than in the Middle East. Various, interests that we've identified over the years are everything from preventing terrorism, preventing nuclear proliferation, spreading democracy, protecting human rights. The list goes on. And the real tragedy of all of this is that this has resulted in a costly military-first approach, but one that actually has not added much to U.S. national security. And so this is an approach that's not only not sustainable, but not very effective. And so it requires us really going back to the drawing board and starting at basics. And I think that's why you asked this question about core U.S. interests, because as someone who studies grand strategy, that's where I always begin, is what are core U.S. national security interests? And when I look at that, I actually think the United States has really one core interest in the Middle East today, a core national security interest, and that is to prevent a regional hegemon. And what I mean by that is a single state that is powerful enough and is able to dominate the region, and particularly dominate the flow of energy supply. If that were to happen, it would create problems for the United States, and that's something we do not want. But this is also a good news story as a result, because when we look at the region and the countries that might be contenders to become a regional hegemon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, none of them are actually powerful enough to make such a bid. Iran has the most, I would say, latent power potential to be a regional hegemon, but even Iran is nowhere near powerful enough to actually try to gain regional hegemony. In order to do that, it would need several things that it really lacks. It would need a modern army and air force that's able to conduct combined arms operations. And as we've seen in Ukraine, this is actually really hard to do, combined arms warfare, particularly on offense. And there's no evidence to suggest that the Iranians are capable of doing that. And it would also need resilient logistics. It would be trying to project its power well beyond its borders, and that's a massive logistics undertaking. And even then, if it were to succeed in conquering places, it would need to be able to occupy and govern them. And we've learned very well that this is extremely challenging to do in the Middle East. And the geography simply works against this kind of hegemonic bid. The distances involved, for example, it's about 1,800 kilometers between Tehran and Riyadh, making this really challenging to do. And so all the talk about the Iranian threat that we see in the media, the reality is actually, it's far less than is actually often made out. And given this threat environment, which is actually not as great as it's often depicted, it raises questions about why we have so many troops deployed in the Middle East. I would argue that those troops are not only not required, given the threat level, but they actually actively undermine U.S. interests, and they do so in 3 ways. First, it intensifies the security dilemma we have with Iran. There's a lot of talk today in D.C. about restoring deterrence. The argument I would make is what we're really seeing are 2 actors, the United States and Iran, that both believe they're at a disadvantage in terms of deterrence, and they're taking tit-for-tat actions to try to shore up their deterrence. And it's leading us down this escalatory path. The second thing I would say is that this forward presence breeds anti-Americanism in the region. We are a lightning rod for these groups, galvanizing them, providing organizational energy. And so the more that we are in the region with a forward military presence, the more we're actually breeding the kind of militant and terrorist threats that we're concerned about. And the final one I would just say is that, like in other regions, it encourages free riding because of the security guarantee. Countries do less for their own security. And then it also creates real entrapment risks in terms of actors engaging in what Barry Poston has called reckless driving, taking more risky actions and policies, but knowing that they can do so because they can fall back on a US security guarantee. And this is another way that it keeps us locked into the region in ways that don't serve us interests, because everything in strategy is about opportunity costs. And the more that we remain in this region, the more it comes at the expense of addressing what are actually serious security concerns to the United States, including like those of China and the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That was a great response, great overview of what's going on with Iran. Rose, would you like to make your opening remarks to the same question?
Yes, I'd love to, and thank you so much for having me join you today. So I'm going to make three major points. The first one is that most of the purported interests that the United States supposedly has in the Middle East that people tend to think about as mattering are really the result of previous policy mistakes and outdated legacies, right? And I'll give you a couple examples of that, right? So one of the, so the main mission of the base in Jordan that was recently hit by Iranian-backed militants, and which the United States has retaliated in various ways in the past few days, that base exists because the United States needed, or felt that it needed, it wouldn't say it actually did, to contain ISIS in Iraq and Syria and beat them back over time, right? ISIS only happened in Iraq and Syria because the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, destabilized it, created essentially a failed state, and allowed these groups to take over large amounts of territory, right? So this is sort of several steps removed from the original thing that got us there, which was the 2003 Iraq War, and which many argued at the time, and certainly most people argue now, was a mistake to begin with, okay? Other relationships in the region are also derivative of Cold War calculations that just no longer matter because the Soviet Union has been gone for 30 years, right? 35 years, I guess, at this point. We have an alliance with the Saudis, right? And that drives a lot of American foreign policy potentially in the Middle East. Our alliance with the Saudis arose during the Cold War because we were worried about containing Soviet influence in the Middle East. We were worried about some anti-American, pro-Soviet regime coming to power in Saudi Arabia, and that potentially leading to cooperation with the Soviets that could hurt the United States in terms of, making it more difficult for the U.S. and its allies to access oil. Right? Soviet Union's gone, so the whole reason behind that partnership is now defunct, right? So many of the things that we are currently involved in are the legacy of past mistakes. Second point, and this underlines the point I'm about to make, which is that I think the single most important interest the U.S. has in the Middle East today is to stay out of war, right? To avoid getting drawn in, because we know what happens when we get drawn into a war in the Middle East. We're there for 20 years, and we keep getting drawn back in with all these sort of ticky-tack attacks on American forces that are there for reasons that mattered 10 years ago but don't today, right? Or 20 years ago. Let's not give the Houthis what they want, right? These groups are attacking shipping, they're attacking American, bases and American targets because they're trying to get a reaction from the United States, right? They're trying to get us to intervene in ways that pin us down more. And I think we should not give them what they want. Okay, and then the third point, I study oil. That's my main gig, right? And I think at this point, the U.S. does not even really have much of a strategic interest in maintaining the flow of Persian Gulf oil, which isn't to say that we want the flow of oil to stop right away. But American military forces are not really needed to ensure access to oil or access to free commerce through the region, even in the face of potential attacks from Houthis or anybody else, right? And that's because markets are just really good at adapting, and they don't need us to intervene to make that happen, right? So I'll give you a couple examples of this real quick. One is the Abqaiq attack in 2019. So Iranian-backed rebels attack this oil facility in Saudi Arabia that processes about 6 million barrels a day out of a global market of 95 million barrels a day, knocks it offline, right? This is the largest oil disruption in history, actual disruption in history. And within 2 days, 50% of production was restored by the Saudis. Turns out these facilities are really easy to fix, right? Within 2 weeks, it's back up to complete production, right, from before the attack. And even though prices jumped about 20% in the days following the attack, within 2 weeks, they were back to normal, right? The US and its allies also maintains large strategic petroleum reserves, right? So we have a built-in cushion already if oil is removed from the market. We have enough in our SPRs, US and American allies. We have a total of about 4 billion barrels, right? That's enough to replace 8 months of oil that could be disrupted if you close the Strait of Hormuz, right? A complete closure, which is probably impossible, right? A complete closure would take about 20% of daily oil production off the market. And we have enough that we could fill that gap for 8 full months, right? So the US is actually much more secure, when it comes to oil and oil access than we tend to think of, simply for market reasons and cushions that we've built over time with SPRs. The final point I would make with that is that ultimately, by trying to subsidize the continued access to cheap oil to world markets in the Persian Gulf, the US is really abetting bad behavior, in the sense that what we really need to do is start hastening the green transition to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, right? So it's really not in American interests anymore to try to maintain cheap, reliable access to Persian Gulf oil. And for the most part, the market does it for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your opening remarks. My first question is going to build right off of what Rose was just talking about, because I think every time we talk, anytime there's a conversation going on about U.S. core interests in the Middle East, for the last, since World War II, you just hear oil, oil, oil. So I really appreciate your opening comments, and I'd like to dive a little bit more into that. So I'll ask Rose this question, and Mike and Kelly, feel free to add on to her comments as you see fit. Do you have any thoughts on why the rhetoric around oil in the Persian Gulf oil in the United States has not matched this reality that you're talking about in terms of market resiliency and how hard it would actually be to block access to cheap oil? Do you have any comments on why the rhetoric around oil is so different from the reality, and who actually is dependent on access to this oil that factors into U.S. foreign policy? We know China's very dependent on it. How does those dependencies factor into U.S. Foreign policy?
Yeah, sure. So it's a great question, and it's a question I've asked myself many times over the years, and there's not a totally, it's a very hard question to answer, right? Why have people not figured this out yet, right? And I think that there's a couple reasons. One, I think it's useful to make arguments about Middle Eastern oil and Middle Eastern oil being important for American foreign policy for other reasons, for domestic foreign policy reasons, right? So if you say, if you want to open up wildlife refuges for drilling, right? You talk about how we depend on Persian Gulf oil and it's so potentially dangerous for us. And so therefore we need to drill, baby, drill, right? If you want to support green energy policy, you talk about, wow, there's all this Persian Gulf oil out there. It's really important to us. It's controlled by dictators and tyrants who hate us. So, this is really bad, and we need to invest in windmills as a result, right? So some of it is that. I think some of it is also just the cultural meme that came out of the 1973 OPEC embargo, which is a total misinterpretation of that case. It drives me absolutely bonkers every time I see it, right? But for a lot of Americans, a lot of older Americans in their formative years, right, they remember that disruption and they think that, oh, this is something that could happen again, right? In terms of dependency, I mean, the whole world is dependent on it in the sense that oil is priced in a global market, and it doesn't matter, as long as you're attached to the global market, you're going to pay the price that everyone else is paying, right? So if the U.S. produced none of its own oil, it would be paying global market prices. If it produced all of its own oil, it would still be paying global market prices, and that gives us some security, but it's a double-edged sword. So anything that makes prices spike for everyone, right? And that's true for China, that's true for the United States, that's true for everywhere else, right? So we're all sort of dependent, but if we can decrease our dependence, it's not about decreasing our dependence on Persian Gulf oil, it's about decreasing our dependence on oil, right? If we don't depend so much on oil, then those spikes won't matter.
And do you have any follow-up comments just on how like the recycling of petrodollars, Saudi reserves held in the dollar and the global currency kind of factors into this obsession with Persian Gulf oil, and how we could potentially manage that relationship in a way that's better than we are now?
Yeah, I think that the importance of petrodollars is totally exaggerated. This is not, that I just think it's exaggerated. I don't have a whole lot more to say than that. It's an argument that people sometimes make, and Saudi will still invest in the United States because the United States is a good place to invest, right? I mean, it's not because we buy a lot of oil from them. It's not, that's not something that matters, I think, very much.
Thank you. We're gonna shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the threats of terrorism that has dominated a U.S. concern and about the Middle East. So we're going to go over to Mike, and I'm going to ask, do you think going forward into the future, in what ways do you think terrorism is still a potential concern, or is it not really a potential concern to the United States, and it's again overinflated the same way some of these oil concerns are? And with that, how do you think that the current force structure in the region is? Do you think it's appropriately matched to what the actual concerns are there in the Middle East?
Yeah, Sabrina, that's a good question. I'm gonna leave the oil stuff to Rose. That's her wheelhouse. I'm gonna focus on my lane here, and I'll say, look, similar to a lot of the issues with oil and energy policy, yeah, there has been a lot of threat inflation on the CT front as well. And I think if we look at the case of Syria, it's really actually enlightening, right? So let's just take sort of the last argument that the current administration made on why we need to be in Syria, right? And that would be in Executive Order 13894. They published that on October 12th, so that's after October 7th, right? Accounting for everything else in the region, the Biden administration, right, in order to continue these, national emergencies and sort of continue the legal basis, everything that goes into the Federal Register for how, our presence is enabled there. They gave two reasons, right, why we have to stay in Syria: the enduring defeat of ISIS, and we can't let Turkey, take more territory in northeast Syria. And for people that aren't tracking, right, in 2019, Turkey, made an incursion into Syria, and they've sort of cordoned off, a small area there, and that gets into sort of, Turkish politics and Erdogan's view that the Kurds are terrorists and everything, and that was done for their security reasons. But if we break those two reasons down, if we just take them at face value, they don't make any sense. And Rose alluded to this a little bit in her opening remarks too. ISIS, and I was part of the counter-ISIS fight, right? The caliphate was destroyed in March of 2019. ISIS has not held territory anywhere in Iraq and Syria since that point. And then on top of that, if you look at even DOD's own Inspector General reports on Operation Inherent Resolve, the group is in survival mode, according to a lot of those very objective assessments coming out of DoD. ISIS has not really demonstrated any what we call, external operations capabilities, where they're actively, and significantly targeting the West or the United States with any kind of, credible capabilities. And so the argument that we have to stay there for ISIS just doesn't really add up to the facts. And then if you look at Turkey, again, this is where I bring in a lot of the conversations I've had with folks across the region over the past few weeks. I've asked them, well, so why should the U.S. take a very hard position on Iran, for example? And I was talking to an Iraqi friend the other day, and he started rattling off, well, the Saudis will do this, and the Egyptians, and I'm not like, okay, so where are the U.S. interests here? Like, you're telling me about why the Saudis might be, upset about X or Y, but you're not really connecting the dots to the U.S. And I think that also gets to Rose's point on a lot of what people think are U.S. interests are really these weird sort of scenarios where our bilateral relationships have gotten so mixed up and confused and backwards that they're sort of doing this math in reverse to kind of get to those points. But anyway, to sort of arrive at my point here, Turkey, if we're worried about a Turkish incursion further into Syria, one, I'd argue that for a lot of reasons, if you look at Turkey's economy, if you look at Erdogan, despite all his bluster, I don't think he really wants to do that right now. But even if we take at face value that there might be some additional Turkish incursion, that just doesn't tie to U.S. interests and in any kind of way that merits the kind of really serious military presence that we're talking about there. And I don't say that callously. I have a ton of affinity for the Kurdish people. I've worked alongside many Kurds in my time, but it's just not a U.S. interest to maintain a presence there forever in service of some kind of situation where really the Kurds will have to acknowledge their sort of local security environment, and they probably will have to start working with the Assad regime and finding other ways to sort of address their interests in the region. And I think that is a big theme here, that we have to return a lot of these local security dynamics to the proper actors here. And there are plenty of groups in the region that have an interest in keeping ISIS down, right? The Kurds do. Even these Shia militia groups that have been attacking U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, they were absolutely critical in the counter-ISIS fight on the ground, especially in Iraq. So on that side, right, I think we need to be prioritizing those actors and trying to get them to a point where they are going to take responsibility. And I think the only way to do that really is to draw down some of the U.S. presence, especially in Iraq and Syria, to kind of spur that along, right? We talk about free riding, we talk about it in the context of China or other powers, but it's the same thing in the Middle East, right? Where some of these groups are not going to take full responsibility as long as the U.S. is sort of holding their hand. So I won't go on too much longer than that, but yeah, I'd say that the overall CT threat is exaggerated. And the last note I'll make really quick is, even if you believe that ISIS poses some kind of critical threat, you have to look at how massively U.S. capabilities, both military capabilities and intel capabilities, have changed over the past 20 years. We have over-the-horizon capabilities, right? We're able to monitor ISIS in Afghanistan with absolutely no presence on the ground there. And there's no reason with all the other U.S. bases in the region and even in Europe that we could do that, do something similar in Iraq and Syria if you're really concerned about the presence of that group. But I'd argue really the reason that we're in Iraq and Syria is to sort of deny oil to the Assad regime in some kind of hope that will ultimately, lead to his ouster. And then really the answer, I think Mitch McConnell even made comments to this effect a couple of weeks ago, we're really there to counter Iran. And that's really at the behest of the Israelis and the Saudis. But yeah, I think the CT threat in general has maybe been more inflated than any other issue actually over the past 20 years.
Thank you. This kind of leads us right into the conversation that Kelly brought up in her opening remarks. In managing these bilateral relations is largely a factor of preventing a hegemon from rising. So let's go to Kelly. I'd like to ask her, what do you think the current policy is for the U.S. in terms of who they favor in these bilateral relations, how that's putting pressure on different actors in different ways that's actually counter to what the U.S. would actually like to see in the Middle East?
Yes. So, I think this is actually part of there's a larger problem that I think is in terms of how we think about coalitions, alliances in general, which is playing out in the Middle East, which is alliances, coalitions are supposed to be a means to an end. They're not an end themselves. And I think we very much confuse that. And so when we look at the Middle East and we think about some of these strategic partnerships we have to actually ask ourselves, are they still serving the kind of political military objective we're trying to achieve today? And I think this gets to Rose's point earlier, which is a lot of this is being inherited from the Cold War. Alliances and coalition relationships that we still sort of carried over without actually asking that question. So I think that's part of the problem of what we're seeing is not a willingness not to actually rethink some of these relationships and whether they actually serve our interests. In terms of how this is playing out, what I think we see is that there has been an attempt across two administrations now to try to construct some version of an anti-Iran coalition and making steps towards that. And there may be a need for an anti-Iran coalition, but I think the question would be, does the United States actually have to be the leader of that coalition? The interests of local actors, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and others, they are clearly the most worried about Iran because it's their neighborhood. And we've actually seen remarkable progress among these actors, and that nothing drives countries together like a common adversary. And that is something that doesn't really require the United States to be leading. That actually, if we can stand back and get out of the way, is likely to happen on its own. And so to the extent possible that we can shift these responsibilities to the local actors that have the most at stake and actually understand the region the best as well, it will better serve U.S. interests because, again, we have other things in the world that we actually need to be paying attention to as opposed to getting more bogged down again in the Middle East.
So I will follow up with you on this and then go over to Mike, as I'm sure he has some comments to say as well. The bulk of our troops, while we are definitely concerned about the troops that are stationed in Syria and Iraq on ongoing targets, the bulk of our troops are in the Persian Gulf. And so our force structure is based around the Persian Gulf. Defense Priorities has released a lot lately about withdrawing troops, specifically from Iraq and Syria. Mike has been a major component in advocating for that. However, I did want to shift away from those troops and just talk about the troops a little bit in the Persian Gulf. So I'll just follow up because you brought it up, Kelly. What role do you think those troops are serving or failing to serve right now in the region, and what do you see as a better option? Follow up with Kelly, and then I'm sure that Mike or Rose might have something to contribute to this as well.
Yeah, so largely I think these troops are there as a presence mission. There's a underlying belief that the United States maintaining a forward presence is stabilizing, that it actually deters adversaries. There are a couple of challenges with that. One is that we can see that adversaries are, like Iran, are concerned about this presence when they look at it and wonder why it's there. They feel that they're the one that is targeted by the presence, and therefore make investments in their militaries that are designed to deter us from taking some kind of action against them. So we've seen them investing a lot in missiles and drones. And so one thing I would just say about this presence is, to the extent that it's serving any U.S. interests, the costs are rising on that presence because the technology is developing in ways that actually make it a lot easier for other actors to target our forces. And so we might look at what is happening in the Red Sea right now, for example, with the Houthis, and think that this is just sort of a one-off, and that we'll over time be able to improve our defenses. That's actually not I think the reality. The warfare is actually changing in ways that are increasingly going to place our troops and our Navy in a vulnerable position. And so what we have to actually ask ourselves is, what is the interest here of having the forces? And as I laid out, there's actually really not we have an interest in preventing a hegemon, but there's not actually a serious hegemonic threat. So the costs that we're paying in having these forces in the Gulf, given what the actual strategic benefit and payoff is disproportionate. And so that's what we have to start rethinking is, do we actually need to pay these kinds of costs, which are coming not in just in terms of financial costs, but also human lives? And my answer to that is no, that there's actually other ways that we could secure US interests, including through diplomacy and economics and other things, instead of always leading with the sword.
Go ahead, we'll jump over to Mike.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a great point. I think I'd also add that, if we're just talking about US troops in the Gulf, another downside is that they function, whether we mean it or not, as a de facto security guarantee for a lot of the host nations, right? And that I think also encourages, I believe Kelly mentioned it earlier, right, the issue of reckless driving. That, if there are US troops stationed here sort of permanently or semi-permanently, right, we can kind of maybe take risks and we can sort of do things as the host country that maybe we wouldn't otherwise do. And I think you can see that, in the Saudi relationship. I think MBS has been, very reckless with a lot of his foreign policy. And if you look back at the beginning of the civil war in Yemen, he was sort of surprised that the U.S. was not taking a bigger role. And because of all the troops, everything else that have been in and out of Saudi Arabia all these years. So, I think that's another downside. I also think too that really the strategic liability of these bases, especially when we're talking about more on the weeds on the military analysis, is another good point that Kelly raised. That look, it's very easy to target these bases. A static presence is not really the advantage that maybe it used to be. Surging forces back and forth from different areas of need is probably the better way to go. And then I'd also say too that our adversaries have been able to become more resilient in the region. That mitigates a lot of the more traditional advantages that you might get from these bases, right? Like with the Houthis, they're so advanced at denial and deception and kind of they've dealt with 9 years worth of airstrikes, from the Saudis with, modern precision guided munitions and, modern generation aircraft. They know the drill, right? And so even the argument that, US military action in a lot of these contexts will degrade capabilities or whatever, right? That you hear that phrase a lot. I think even that is probably a stretch, let alone the issue of deterring them or changing their strategic calculus, which is just not going to happen. But on the basis, I think that is an issue where if we don't make it clear, especially with a lot of this talk on the Saudi-Israel normalization, that we are not going to provide security guarantees, countries will take U.S. troop presences to mean that, and that's another downside, I think, of kind of this region bestriding, world bestriding presence.
We're going to jump over to Rose. She had something to add to this.
Yes, thank you. So also on this point, as it relates to both Kelly's point and Mike's point, two of the sort of threats to oil that are talked about in the Middle East are, one, the rise of a hegemon, but two, the other one tends to be, well, what if somebody, I'm looking at you, Iran, what if somebody tries to block the flow of oil through through the Strait of Hormuz, right, where 20% of oil goes. And that's often seen as that's the military mission that the United States is trying to deter by having forces in the region, right? But it's exactly the reckless driving problem, right? Because one of the reasons why 20% of the world's oil goes through that is because the United States has said it's going to keep it open by force if necessary, right? There's nothing inevitable about using that strait to transport oil out of the Middle East, right? The Saudis in recent years have built pipelines to the Red Sea and to the Mediterranean, right? And those pipelines cost something, but they're not that expensive, right? They can easily afford to pay for them. And if we really wanted to, we could help pay for them too, right? But they do it. They're not building more of those pipelines because they can get free security from us to just ship it through the Strait of Hormuz.
And so to Mike's point about the resilience of adversaries, I think Kelly had something that she wanted to add to these points.
Yeah, I think this is actually a really important point because I study air power in addition to grand strategy, and the United States is addicted to airstrikes. And we can see this play out repeatedly in the Middle East. And I think we have to look at why that is. And I think it's because people don't actually understand air power very well and what it can achieve. And so if you look at the discussion we've been having about using airstrikes to respond to these Houthi attacks, it seems to me that the DC largely believes that it's about punishment, that we can raise the costs enough using airstrikes to change the mind of these actors, so that they don't target the United States. Here's the problem with that. There's a large body of academic literature that shows that punishment campaigns using air power to punish adversaries doesn't work. You simply can't raise the costs enough. And so the way to actually do that is through denial, showing the adversary that you can actually prevent them from achieving their military political objective. And this is where it comes to Mike's point, which is these adversaries have recognized how the US relies on air power. So they've distributed their assets. They've made it way more resilient, which reduces our ability to actually seriously put at risk their ability to achieve their objectives. And so we are essentially relying on air power, expecting it's somehow going to make the costs enough and change minds and restore deterrence, when that's actually not feasible. And we're not actually coming to terms with the limits of the use of force and what it can achieve. And yet we can't seem to break this addiction on somehow believing this time air power is actually going to accomplish it.
That's brilliantly said. I agree with all that. And I think too, I would add, there is this, why DC is so addicted to this. I think it really is therapeutic. I think it really is optics driven, and it feels, air power feels like it's, making some kind of big difference. But Kelly is absolutely spot on. If you've studied a lot of these groups, they are far more sophisticated at sort of blunting the specific effects of air power than most people realize in the policy discussion in DC. And you have to almost wonder, why is that? Why is that not more often discussed? That, especially when it comes to the Houthis, we're not making a dent. I mean, you're talking about upwards of some estimates of 200,000 fighters, and you're talking about, hundreds to thousands of, anti-ship ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and all sorts of sophisticated decoys and false emitters and stuff that really does, I think people have trouble believing this, really does spoof and fool, U.S. Air and naval assets, and it does kind of create headaches. And so, look, yeah, I mean, I had a piece in Responsible Statecraft on this, I think a week ago. It's absolutely true. The way to go about this really is looking at diplomacy, and it's also kind of looking again at what the realities are of the economic cost for the U.S. in the Red Sea. And the one thing I'll just throw out, in December, we saw a 65% decline in expected freight volumes through the Red Sea, and we saw a 1% decline in net U.S. imports during December. So again, people can make the argument, yeah, there are big impacts for China, there are big impacts for Europe. That's another reason why they should probably step up, diplomatically in other ways if they want to solve this problem. But there aren't very significant impacts for the U.S. And there was some new data out, I believe, from Goldman Sachs this week, looking at the effects on inflation. And I think they found basically a rounding error, something like 0.1% increase for global inflation from everything going on in the Red Sea. So just piggybacking on Kelly's point there. But no, I completely agree.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we're going to go over to Rose, because I think Kelly sparked quite a bit of thoughts on that topic.
Yes, I mean, both Kelly and Mike have made awesome points. And, to underline the problem of trying to retaliate against the Houthis with air power, I mean, this is also cost exchange problem, right? We're putting $1 million missiles on $5 tents, right? Or, I don't know, maybe $100 drones, right? They can, it's so easy for them to dollar for dollar outmatch what we're doing, right? And according to the Defense Department, they estimated a couple weeks ago, this was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, that the U.S. has already spent $1.6 billion on the mission to protect commerce in the Red Sea, right? So it's extremely costly for us to do this with very little benefit, and they can replace their losses with, not very much money.
So I would like to follow this up with a question I had that you all kind of touched upon, is if we shift away from this strategy of punishment, which you all agree is clearly not working and is probably doing more damage than anything else. Kelly mentioned shifting to a strategy of denial instead. I'd like to talk about what that actually looks like, how the US could hope to actually achieve that. Kelly brought it up, so we'll start with her. but I'm more than happy to hear everyone's thoughts.
Yeah, so I think we actually have to start at the level of grand strategy. And I am someone who thinks that we need to shift to more of an offshore balancing approach. Instead of having a permanent forward deployed military presence, really we need to take a step back, withdraw largely from the region, militarily at least, withdrawal, and only intervene at moments when there's really something critical, that if it looked like there was a possibility that Iran was going to be able to dominate the region. And first allowing local actors to deal with that problem first. But essentially, instead of being the constant first responder, which is what we are now, we've become the sort of, security guarantor of last resort. But in order to do that, we actually have to have discipline. And I think that's the thing we're lacking, is we can say that we need to do this, but we actually don't have the discipline. If you go back to the administration's national security strategy or its national defense strategy, I forget which one, it actually talks about the need to be ruthless in our prioritization. And they're right. They understand the problem. The challenge, though, is in the day-to-day world, we actually don't subscribe to that. And so I think that's the place to start, is actually defining interest more narrowly and moving out of the region, pulling back militarily and exercising discipline around that.
Rose, would you like to follow that up with what a offshore balancing strategy, or a more disciplined strategy, would actually look like in the Persian Gulf, and how it might potentially impact, for better or for worse, the countries that are there and are positioned with them? Sure.
So I would take it even a step further, maybe a half step, but maybe a full step further, which is to say, there's two things at work here, right? There's having a forward presence in the Middle East, and then there's having a commitment to the Middle East, whether we have troops forward or at Diego Garcia or somebody somewhere else, right? We could take an offshore balancing approach, which moves our forces over the horizon. But we could also take an approach where we basically say, look, it doesn't make sense for us to even have this defense commitment at all, right? And I would want to push us down that route, because as long as we have commitments, and as long as, whether we're over the horizon or not, some of the reckless driving is going to continue, right? And the reckless driving is really bad for us. It gets us into accidents. So that's where I would like to see us go in the future. And the fact of the matter is that the Middle East is really much less important to us than other regions of the world, right? East Asia is much more important to the United States. That's where the next hegemon is going to be, right? Or potentially already is, i.e. China, depending on how you think about their power, right? So this is all kind of a sideshow, and it's a distraction. And I think it's unfortunately the case that for political reasons, it's very hard for American leaders to maintain that discipline of staying offshore. Right? That's sort of the problem with offshore balancing. It's a great idea, but it's so tempting to get involved, and that discipline is just not something that we're very good at sustaining based on the past, 25 years of history.
We're going to jump over to Mike, and given your professional experience in the region militarily, do you generally agree with these assessments? Is there any areas that you think the U.S. would need to stay to keep an eye on, hold out for, or what's your general assessment of their ideas here?
Yeah, I think, look, starting with, working small to big, I guess, on these questions is kind of how I would advocate working through it. And I think some of these smaller U.S. presences that also happen to be, difficult to defend, difficult to maintain logistically, and very tangentially tied to any kind of U.S. interest, yeah, I would wipe those off the map immediately, right? So that would be basically anything in Iraq and Syria. That would be, the Levant writ large. I think there's more stuff that you could do there. And then I think you would have to work over to a lot of the Gulf bases and everything like that. And that would be a long, drawn out process, right? Looking at this more from a practitioner perspective, that would be very difficult to do for the U.S. But I do think that on a strategic level, we would be benefited by, again, I think one of the themes I want to keep returning here to is putting all of this back onto local actors. So in that sense, yeah, I'm absolutely in favor of getting to a closer to a point of offshore balancing, reducing U.S. security commitments in the region. And I think removing troops is a way to do that. And I think if there are issues that arise, we have strategic capabilities. We have global strike capabilities. There are ways that the U.S. can still, when necessary, I guess, leverage military capabilities in the region. I mean, you even saw right over the last week with some of these strikes in Iraq and Syria, you had B-1 bombers take off in the continental United States, go over to the U.S. Go over to Iraq and Syria, complete a mission and fly home all in one go, right? So it kind of begs the question, what do you need all of these other bases for, especially when they're really just leveraged for Iran or other regional powers to try to start, a conflict with the United States or bait us into some sort of, tit for tat scenario. So yeah, I think it would take time to do that. But I think writ large too, the last point I want to make is that the amount of time that is spent on the Middle East in a bureaucratic level as well is so significant. And, as recently as 2021, you had about 2 to 3 times just the number of people, just men and women, analysts, operators, whatever, in the intel community focused on ISIS than you did on China. And Director Burns at CIA has changed some of that. But think about this, right? And I think that's another issue I want to raise. It's kind of apropos of nothing, but this idea that, we have different, combatant commands, and we have, NSC country directors for all these different parts of the world, and so the U.S. can really handle all these things at one time. I think if you know how Washington works, there's maybe 10 or 15 people in the national security bureaucracy that can really pick up the phone and get something done, right? So I would argue too that just the more pernicious ways that people don't see every day, where the Middle East takes up 2/3 of the chairman's deck, right, for the Joint Chiefs, that briefing every morning. If that's the kind of intel you're looking at every day, the Middle East is just going to take up more of your time than it otherwise would. So while I agree on the grand strategic level, things like offshore balancing, things like evaluating our core interests are really important, but I would argue on the far other end of that spectrum, on sort of the very tactical policymaking minutia side of things, there are reforms and changes I think that have to be made there too to try to effectuate kind of the changes that we're talking about. And again, this over focus on the Middle East has reared its head in the bureaucracy in really ugly ways over the past 2 decades too.
Thank you. I just want to kind of follow up too with a question about that. We hear a lot of rhetoric when it comes to this, is that if we leave the Middle East, China's going to swoop in like some sort of predatory bird and just take over the whole region. And I'm going to pose this question to Rose because it seems fresh out of her book to think about how a power is trying to secure oil, a rising power here. So what are your thoughts on a reduction of the U.S. role in the Middle East and what China wants or is aiming for? We've seen some activity from them in the region, partnerships with Iran, the base in Djibouti, talking of the places that are bargaining with them. So how do you see China's desires in the area, and what the U.S. should or should not be worried about with that?
Yeah. So, this is kind of a flippant way of putting it, but I would sort of say to China, like, if you want to get involved in the Middle East, have at it. Right? This has not gone well for the United States, right? This is, it's not what we historically call the graveyard of empires. That's Afghanistan, but this is a morass, right? If China, so let's first start with the premise. The premise that people usually start with is, well, the U.S. is there and we help underwrite, oil market security by preventing anything from getting out of hand in the Middle East. Well, by that logic, China is totally free riding on what we're doing in the Middle East, right? So if China decides to actually start contributing in that way, and it actually does help stabilize oil markets, great, right? They're no longer free riding on us. In reality, I think even, I think that premise itself is wrong. I don't think that American involvement in the Middle East is really necessary. And it's been very costly and has gotten us into lots of problems and lots of wars. So, again, if China wants to do it, have at it. It's also the case that they are so far away from having the ability to project real power in the region, right? 20 years, 30 years at least, right? And the United States still far outmatches them in power projection capabilities. So there's really nothing that's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years that the Chinese are going to be able to one-up us militarily in the Persian Gulf, right? And I certainly hope that in the next 20 or 30 years, we will be transitioning away from oil enough that the Middle East just will not matter in the same way that it historically has.
Thank you. Do you have something you'd like to add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see this argument a lot, and it certainly sounds like the Cold War. That we're trying to create these. We need to be here because the Soviets were there, and this has a similar feel to it. I would just say that there's no actual evidence that the Chinese actually want to be deeply involved in the Middle East. I think what we actually see is that they're very cautious, really, in the Middle East. Yes, they want relationships because of oil and because of economic opportunities. What I think we see is actually the Chinese like options, strategic options. That's actually different than wanting to control the Middle East. There's really no evidence of that. And I think the Red Sea is actually very revealing here in the sense that this is an area where trade flows between Europe and Asia. And Rose spoke about this. Essentially, the Chinese are free riding on our operations there to keep the Red Sea, protect the Red Sea. And they are really not interested in taking on that role. And so I think what you could ask yourself then is, are we actually doing a disservice to our interests by continuing to provide this kind of capacity where China gets to free ride and almost in some ways allowing the Chinese to steer us in this direction because it's good for them. The more that we're in the Middle East, we're not in East Asia. And they certainly recognize this.
Thank you so much. It's a very, very good point to be made too. As we near the end of the hour, we're just going to wrap up here. Mike, do you have any final remarks or policy recommendations that you'd like to add in that you haven't had a chance to yet?
Sure. Yeah. I guess I would say, for people that are very, interested in preserving American hegemony at all costs, I would say this, if you care about preserving American hegemony at all in what is clearly a more pluralistic world, the first step to that is admitting that U.S. obsession with dominating the Middle East has done more to diminish American hegemony than literally anything else that has happened over the last 20 years. So I would say that. And I would also just reiterate, some of my opening remarks that there are no vital or existential U.S. interests in the region. We kind of talked through how a lot of the interests that people have, stated or put forward over the past 20 years can either be, they're either overtaken by events or they no longer apply or they're misunderstood. And the very few, U.S. interests that are left to kind of handle, we can handle just fine without anything close to the amount of blood, treasure, presence that we have sunk into the region over the last 20 years. And on the policy side, I think a lot of this starts with the conflict in Gaza. And I think a lot of this starts with the sort of horizontal escalation that we've seen spread across the region in recent weeks. And removing U.S. troops from Iraq and Syria would be the initial piece to the puzzle, in my view, on the policy side.
Thank you. Kelly, do you have anything you'd like to finish out with?
Yes, I think what I would just say is focus on something that we often see as an argument against what essentially the three of us are proposing is this issue of U.S. credibility. That if the United States pulls back from the Middle East, then the credibility of its commitments in Europe or the Indo-Pacific will be questioned. And I think that's a really deeply flawed argument. Credibility doesn't work quite that way. Actors tend to see it as specific to their context. But there's actually credibility damage we're doing with maintaining the status quo. Because if I were a U.S. ally, for example, in Asia, and I were watching these events, what I would see is that the United States lacks strategic discipline. And it says it's going to protect me, and it says it's getting serious about what's happening in Asia. And yet we are not able to be disciplined enough to not return to the Middle East. And so how we think about credibility, if we are concerned about that, we need to think about the credibility of our reputation in terms of our ability to execute in a confident way strategy. And the other thing I would just say is we like to talk a lot in DC about our allies and partners being our greatest strategic advantage. And yet we don't seem to want to trust them to actually manage their own problems. And so if we're going to continue to say that they're our strategic advantage, then let's use it and allow them to actually manage problems that are within their capabilities, and take a step back. And that's going to require a different conception of what American leadership means in the world. Doesn't mean that we're going to completely come home and be isolationist. What it means is we're going to be more disciplined. We're going to be active and engaged in the world, but again, not always leading with the US military.
Thank you. And Rose, any final comments or remarks?
I would just say, again, for me, if I have to make one takeaway point, we need to avoid getting drawn into a war in the Middle East, right? There are actors in the Middle East that are attacking American targets because they want us to respond. We need to, take a chapter from the self-help literature that talks about the gray rock strategy, right? When somebody's trying to get a rise out of you, right? You just make yourself as boring as possible, right? You don't respond. You don't feed the cycle, right? There's a reason that countries are trying to get us involved. Either they have their own interests that they want us to take care of for them, or in the case of the Houthis, they just want us to flounder some more, right? The war in Iraq, 2003, was the largest strategic mistake the United States has made in at least 30 years, maybe much longer. We need to avoid at all costs making another mistake like that.
Thank you so much for those final thoughts. And thank you to all of the panelists. This has been a great and very realistic conversation about the Middle East, which is quite refreshing. Thank you to Defense Priorities for hosting this event. And we're going to conclude there. I hope everyone has a great day.